It begins not with a bang, but with a silence so thick it hums. Imagine this: a grand Victorian portrait of royal perfection. Kings, queens, princes, and a princess, all posed in still life elegance, as if the camera had captured the very order of the empire. But look closer. In the space between Prince George and Princess Mary, there's a gap. Subtle, haunting, a place where a child should be, but isn't. That missing presence was no accident. He was the sixth child of King George V and Queen Mary, born into privilege, yet swept from view like a smudge on a polished crown. His name was Prince John, and for nearly a century, he was the royal family's ghost. Official biographies erased him. His name disappeared from family trees. Portraits were cropped. Even his funeral, quiet, unroyal, passed with barely a whisper. But why? Why would a child of the crown be hidden so completely, so deliberately? What secret could be so shameful that it was buried deeper than the boy himself? This is not a fairy tale. This is a true story. One of fragility, shame, and a monarchy terrified of its own reflection. And today, we reopen the royal vault. Because the shadow in that portrait, his name was John, and he mattered. Prince John was born into the most powerful family in the British Empire on July 12, 1905, a time when royalty was still seen as divine, untouchable, almost mythic. The British crown was at its imperial height, and with it came the expectation of perfection. Every child born to King George V and Queen Mary was more than a son or daughter. They were symbols, and symbols, as we know, aren't allowed to crack. John was their youngest, the sixth and final child. By all appearances, he was just another royal infant swaddled in lace and duty. But from the start, something didn't quite fit. He didn't speak as early as his siblings. He was clumsy, overly energetic, unpredictable in public. And behind the scenes, whispers began to circulate. His early years at Sandringham were, by some accounts, joyful. He was called Johnny by his family, doted on by his nanny, Charlotte Lala Bill, and adored by his siblings, at least while they were young enough not to notice he was different. He played mischievous pranks, glued doorknobs, and once crashed a formal dinner party dressed as a Native American with his sister's paint box. For a moment, it was all charmingly royal, a cheeky young prince in the countryside. But the court was watching, and the court doesn't like chaos. By the age of 4, Johnny had his first epileptic seizure. The doctors called it a convulsion, but the truth was already unfolding behind the palace walls. Prince John was not like the others. In private, the royal family began to panic. What would the public say if they knew? A prince with seizures? A boy who struggled to follow instructions, who sometimes wandered aimlessly through the palace halls. This was not the image of regal poise they were desperate to protect. And so, bit by bit, decision by decision, a quiet exile began. Not out of cruelty, at least not at first, but out of fear. Fear of scandal, fear of imperfection, fear that the monarchy itself could bleed. The child had been born into a golden cage, but soon they would decide that even the cage was too visible. The British monarchy has always been a master of illusion, but behind every curtain lies a cost, and for Prince John, that cost was his very presence. As he grew, so did the signs. His seizures became more violent, his speech slower, his moments of stillness more distant. While today we might understand his condition as a combination of epilepsy and possibly autism, in the early 1900s, these diagnoses carried a far darker weight. They weren't simply misunderstood. They were feared. Feared as curses, as degeneracy, as proof that the divine right of kings was perhaps not so divine after all. At 4, Johnny experienced his first full seizure. It shook the family to its core. But rather than respond with empathy or education, the House of Windsor responded with strategy. His illness was deemed a family matter, a euphemism for complete secrecy, no announcements, no medical bulletins, no appearances. Publicly, he ceased to exist. Official royal portraits stopped including him after 1913. When Queen Mary and King George celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in 1918, the official photograph, meant to symbolize unity and strength, was taken without their youngest son. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. There were only 5 royal children. And yet, within the palace walls, something more complex was happening. His father, King George V, often remembered as cold and distant, even confessed to U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt that of all his children, John was the only one he couldn't bring himself to discipline. It was as if, in his own rigid way, George saw the fragility of his son and chose not to break him further. But that fragile empathy wasn't enough to stop what came next. By 1916, the decision was made. Prince John would be removed from court life altogether. The justification? His seizures were becoming more frequent, more severe, and he was no longer progressing in his studies. But the truth was crueler. He was now a risk to the monarchy's image, a risk they were no longer willing to take. And so, they packed up the boy who once made the palace laugh and sent him 2 miles away, to Wood Farm, a quiet, unremarkable house tucked away on the Sandringham estate. It was to be his final stage, and the curtains had already begun to close. Wood Farm was never meant to be a prison, but for a 13-year-old prince, torn from the warmth of his family and thrust into obscurity, it might as well have been. Nestled in the Norfolk countryside, Wood Farm was peaceful, remote, and, most importantly for the crown, out of sight. From the outside, it was just another charming estate house. Inside, it became a royal purgatory, where Prince John, the boy once destined to dine with kings, now lived under whispered supervision. His royal tutors were dismissed. His formal education came to a halt. His world shrank to a quiet garden, a few loyal servants, and one woman who refused to leave his side. Charlotte Lala Bill, his nanny, became his everything, caretaker, confidant, surrogate mother. She had been with John since his birth, and when the royal family turned inward, she stayed. Their bond was the one thread left unbroken in a life unraveling by royal design. She gave him structure, she gave him joy, she gave him what the crown would not, love without condition. But even Lala couldn't replace the hollow that formed when your parents stopped visiting as often, when your siblings' footsteps no longer echo down the hallway. Despite what some later accounts suggested, John wasn't entirely abandoned. He saw his family on occasion. There were garden visits from his grandmother, Queen Alexandra, letters exchanged with his mother, but they were breadcrumbs on a path that led away from the palace and ultimately away from the world. To fill the long, slow days, Queen Alexandra encouraged him to take up gardening, not as a hobby, but as therapy. The young prince took to it with the kind of devotion that comes not from passion, but from survival. Each plant he nurtured was a companion. Each pressed flower, a silent letter. He'd collect his most beautiful blooms and send them to his mother, as if to say, "I'm still here. Don't forget me." And then, unexpectedly, light flickered through the gloom. In the form of a girl named Winifred Thomas. She wasn't a noble. She wasn't staff. She was a local child, someone Prince John had met years earlier, and fate brought her back to Sandringham. With Winifred, he laughed again. They wandered the estate, tended to the garden side by side, and invented their own little kingdom far from royal expectations. For the first time in years, Prince John wasn't the boy who was hidden. He was just a boy, mischievous again, curious again. alive again. But exile has a way of settling in the bones. And just when it seemed like he might reclaim a piece of his stolen childhood, the storm inside him stirred once more. The seizures returned, stronger, more violent. His joy, as fleeting as spring bloom, began to wither. And the quiet exile of Prince John edged ever closer to its tragic conclusion. In the last years of his life, Prince John's world had narrowed, but within that confinement, he carved out a fragile pocket of beauty. Wood Farm may have been a royal exile, but to Johnny, it became a sanctuary wrapped in wildflowers and birdsong, an Eden of his own making, far removed from the golden prison of Buckingham Palace. With every tremor of his illness, he grew further from the throne but closer to the earth. Gardening, encouraged by Queen Alexandra, was more than a pastime. It became his salvation. Where the palace demanded posture, the garden embraced mess. Where the crown insisted on silence, the wind through the trees offered a lullaby. He would spend hours tending to the flower bed she had gifted him, carefully planting, trimming, pressing petals into books, as if preserving pieces of himself before they could be forgotten. And in that quiet garden, a most unlikely friendship bloomed. Winifred Thomas, the local girl who had reappeared in his life like a living memory, quickly became more than a playmate. She was his anchor. Together they laughed, roamed the estate, picked flowers, chased birds, and built imaginary kingdoms among the hedgerows. She treated him not as a prince or a patient, but simply as Johnny, a boy, a friend, a soul worth knowing. When he was with her, he wasn't broken, he wasn't hidden, he was whole. And for a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed like the story might shift, that perhaps, even under the cold shadow of monarchy, this forgotten child might grow into something more. There were signs of that hope. Stories told by staff speak of a mischievous sparkle returning to his eyes. He was back to playing tricks, once again gluing doorknobs and flipping cushions with drawing pins. The boy who had vanished was re-emerging from the fog, and yet the garden was also a mirror. Every bloom he pressed and sent to Queen Mary was a silent plea. See me, remember me, I'm still yours. He never said it aloud. He didn't need to. It was there in the careful wrapping, the smudged ink of his shaky handwriting, the innocence behind each flower's preservation. They weren't just gifts, they were artifacts of love, proof that even a prince buried in silence could still reach out, desperate to be heard. But seasons change, flowers fade, and no garden, no matter how sacred, can keep the storm at bay forever. Behind the laughter and pressed petals, his seizures were growing worse, and no one, not even Lala, could ignore the quiet, mounting dread. The boy was blooming, yes, but so too was the shadow that had haunted his life from the beginning. And in the distance, winter was coming. While Prince John cultivated beauty in solitude, the world outside was unraveling in horror. The Great War, World War I, raged across Europe. Millions of lives were lost in trenches soaked with blood and mud. Empires trembled. Nations cried out for leadership, for reassurance, for a symbol of strength. And so, the British monarchy answered with pageantry and presents. King George V and Queen Mary crisscrossed the country in grim procession, comforting the wounded, mourning the dead, rallying a broken nation. Duty demanded everything, and in that thunderous call to rule, their youngest son was left behind. The war became a convenient veil. With the empire engulfed in conflict, who would ask questions about the sixth child who had quietly vanished? Publicly, they had 5 children. Privately, Prince John remained tucked away behind ivy-covered walls, his life reduced to whispered updates, folded letters, and hopeful blooms. But this was no mere wartime oversight. It was a deliberate silence. In an age where epilepsy was seen as madness, where any hint of mental fragility threatened the illusion of divine royalty, hiding Prince John became a form of damage control. The palace could not afford weakness. The people needed strength, even if that strength was a lie. Behind palace doors, there were moments of grief. Lala recorded that John's parents still visited, though less frequently. Queen Mary, known for her icy composure, was said to soften when reading his letters. King George, the stern disciplinarian, admitted he couldn't bring himself to punish John like the others. But their affection was constrained, filtered through protocol and fear. And so, the young prince became a paradox, deeply loved but painfully hidden. As his health worsened, the family grew more distant, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of helplessness. His seizures came without warning, violent storms that left him exhausted and confused. His siblings stopped visiting, not because they didn't care, but because watching him suffer became unbearable. His mother noted that even allowing him near the other children became too traumatic for them all. It was a tragic irony. In trying to shield him, they abandoned him. In trying to protect the family, they fractured it. But through it all, John held on to the only thing they hadn't taken: his spirit. In a world that chose to forget him, he refused to forget how to feel, how to laugh, how to grow, how to send a flower and believe it meant something. And then, on one cold Christmas day in 1918, the royal family gave him a gift. For a brief, beautiful moment, they welcomed him back into the main house. He spent the entire day among his siblings, his parents, his people. It would be the last day they ever saw him alive. The house was warm that Christmas. Fires crackled, carols drifted through the grand halls, and for once the royal family sat as one, complete, if only for a moment. Prince John, pale but smiling, was there. Seated at the table, surrounded by laughter and finery, he looked less like a secret and more like a son. It was the first time in months that he was allowed back into the heart of royal life. The family embraced him. The staff were careful but kind. And for one fleeting day, the past and present held hands in fragile peace. Perhaps they sensed what was coming, or maybe they didn't dare to think it. That evening, as twilight swallowed Sandringham, John returned to Wood Farm, his exile dressed in ribbons. He brought with him the joy of the day, the warmth of family, something he'd not felt in so long. Lala helped him into bed. He laughed as she tucked him in, and somewhere in that small room tucked away from the world, a quiet descended. Then came the seizure. It was sudden, violent, unforgiving. By the time dawn began to crawl across the horizon of January 18, 1919, the prince, the boy, the gardener, the ghost of the crown, was gone. He died in his sleep at just 13 years old. Word traveled slowly. There was no national mourning, no royal decree, no black draped balcony or solemn funeral procession, just silence. Carefully curated silence. To the monarchy, his death was not just a tragedy, it was a relief, a cruel truth, whispered behind palace doors. His father, King George, called it the greatest mercy. His mother, Queen Mary, wept, then returned to her duties. But for Lala, who had held him, fed him, laughed and cried beside him, it was the moment her heart stopped beating in rhythm with the world. She kept a photo of John above her mantle until the day she died, alongside a note he once gave her: "Nanny, I love you." No state funeral, no crowds, just the staff of Sandringham gathering at the edge of the estate, tears freezing on their cheeks. They covered his grave with flowers, hundreds of them, wildflowers, garden blooms, tokens from those who truly knew him. And then, as if on cue, the silence returned. Not a single mention in court circulars, not a breath of him in public. Prince John, the sixth child of the king, was erased from history in a whisper. But shadows don't disappear. They linger, they wait, and eventually they demand to be seen. His funeral was unlike any royal farewell. There were no solemn parades, no foreign dignitaries, no church bells echoing across the capital. Instead, Prince John was laid to rest in the cold earth of Sandringham, surrounded not by crowns and scepters, but by gardeners, maids, cooks, and stable hands, the people who had truly known him. His burial was tender, quiet, heartbreakingly human. His grave, nestled beneath a canopy of winter trees, was soon covered in flowers, plucked from the very gardens he had once so carefully tended. It was as though the earth itself grieved for him, offering petals where the monarchy offered none. And then came the erasure. In the weeks following his death, newspapers briefly reported the passing of a young royal. The Daily Mirror revealed, almost as an afterthought, that John had suffered from epilepsy. It was the first time the public learned the truth, and it was the last they heard of him for nearly 80 years. From that moment on, the official narrative shifted. Royal biographies listed 5 children, not 6. Family trees quietly omitted his name. It was as if he had never been born. Like a chapter torn from a book, his story became a rumor, then a whisper, then nothing at all. Even his older brother, Prince Edward, the future King Edward VIII, wrote coldly of him as more of a burden than a blessing. In one letter, he dismissed his youngest sibling's death as a nuisance, a disruption to the rhythm of royal life. That single sentence would haunt the family's legacy for decades. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back through the soil. For the staff of Sandringham and for Lala, Prince John never vanished. His memory lived in their stories, in the photos hidden in drawers, in the pressed flowers tucked into old books. His presence lingered in the corners of the estate, in the hush of the nursery, in the breeze that moved through the gardens he once adored. The monarchy may have tried to forget him, but the land, the people, the truth, they never did. And all it took was one photograph, decades later, to break the silence. It was 1998 when the silence broke. Inside a dust-covered royal album once owned by Edward VIII, a forgotten set of photographs was found. Faded but intact, they revealed what official records had long denied. Prince John, smiling, laughing, held in the arms of his brothers, playing in the gardens of Sandringham. Not a ghost, not a burden, but a boy, a brother, a son. That quiet discovery shattered the polished facade of the royal narrative. Suddenly, historians and journalists began asking the questions that had long gone unanswered. Who was Prince John, really? Why was he hidden? And what does it say about a monarchy willing to erase one of its own? In 2003, the BBC released The Lost Prince, a poignant and haunting dramatization of his life that forced Britain and the world to confront the boy it had forgotten. Audiences wept. For the first time, people saw not just a prince with an illness, but a child with dreams, laughter, fears, and a deep hunger to be loved. It reopened a wound that had never been allowed to heal. More than a century after his birth, Prince John emerged not just as a historical footnote, but as a symbol of how power fears vulnerability, of how families, even the most powerful ones, can break under the weight of expectations, and of how silence can bury truth for a time, but never forever. The photos proved what the monarchy had spent generations trying to deny. He was one of them, fully, completely, undeniably. And more than that, he was one of us, fragile, flawed, beautifully human. Now, over a century later, the question lingers like mist over the fields of Sandringham. Was Prince John truly abandoned, or was he, in a way, protected? The answer, like much of royal history, isn't clean. It's layered, messy, human. To modern eyes, his story may look like a cruel act of erasure, a child exiled, hidden from view, quietly grieved, and deliberately forgotten. But to those within the palace walls, it may have felt like mercy. A choice made not out of malice, but out of fear, confusion, and perhaps love twisted by power. They feared the headlines. They feared scandal. But maybe, too, they feared what the world would do to a boy like John, how the public would sneer, how history would chew him up, how the crown would tremble under the weight of his seizures. So they built him a smaller world, a gentler one, a garden kingdom far from the throne, but not far from love. In that world, he had Lala, he had Winifred, he had Queen Alexandra, he had wildflowers, pranks, laughter, and joy. Brief as it was a life with moments of sunlight, sheltered, yes, but not without soul. Still, it wasn't enough. Because love without presence, memory without name, is a quiet kind of betrayal. In trying to shield him, they erased him. In trying to spare him the cruelty of the world, they committed a quieter one of their own. And yet, even in his absence, he never truly disappeared. Not from Lala's mantle, not from Winifred's heart, not from the roots of the garden he once tended, which still bloom each spring like stubborn reminders. So was he forgotten? No, not anymore. We remember him now, not as a burden, not as a royal shame, but as a child whose story deserved to be told from the very beginning. And in doing so, we return something the crown once took away: his name, his truth, his place in history. In the great saga of British royalty, of empires risen and fallen, of coronations and abdications, scandals and triumphs, Prince John remains a footnote. But perhaps he should have been the whole story. Not because he ruled, not because he led armies or signed treaties, but because in his quiet suffering, in his gentle joys, he revealed a truth far more profound than any royal decree: that humanity does not disappear behind titles, nor does pain bow before crowns. He lived only 13 years, but in those years he loved deeply, laughed wildly, and yearned, above all, to be seen. Not as a prince, not as a problem, just as Johnny. And now, over a century later, he is seen, fully, finally. So the next time you look at a royal portrait, at the polished faces and perfect posture, look for the space between them, the shadow in the frame. Because in that empty place, there once lived a boy who was never meant to be forgotten. His name was Prince John. And now he never will be. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what it means to be forgotten and to be remembered, then don't let this be the last time we uncover the truth together. Like this video if you believe stories like Prince John's deserve to be told. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the hidden chapters history tried to bury. And in the comments below, tell us, do you think Prince John was a victim of cruelty or a child quietly protected in the only way the monarchy knew how? This is more than royalty. This is real life, raw, tragic, and finally, remembered. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.